listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter.
Welcome, everybody. This is another episode on Jordan Peterson and Enigma. It's part 2, basically. So the first part was essentially a real broad brush on some of the issues that I pick up on and that I essentially sort of sit with and, critique. This particular episode is about deep diving a little bit further into specifics. I'm aware that the first episode was quite generalised, and that's okay. It's sort of like a bit of a foundation. As I said, the title that I used, and that is that Jordan Peterson is an enigma, I stick with. He is an extraordinarily complex person. One of the struggles that I've had with, how do I put this together so that it's intelligible and not, it's not just an academic or overly intellectualized philosophical, scientific critique, but something that's accessible to the everyday person who doesn't necessarily have this level of education. And I'm not using that in an elitist way. It's a bit like me trying to understand quantum physics. Fortunately, Brian Cox has been able to make that more accessible to me by a 60-second YouTube video, which gives me a broad brush, okay? In this instance, it's in the same vein. I'm trying to get some really complex ideas across and then critique them in understandable language, because one of my critiques of Jordan Peterson is that this man is exceptionally good at dazzling us with language and with definition and logical connections. And this is where, if you've got the education, you can actually begin to pick him apart. And, I come back to that idea that if you can't explain it simply, there's something wrong, right? Any concept needs to be able to be put together and put forward in an understandable way. Okay, even notions such as the survival of the fittest is actually a highly complex concept in evolution, which is often misunderstood, and certainly it's used by conservatives, neoliberals as literal. That is, that evolution is all about the survival of the fittest, and so strength, power, dominance, and control are the centre key elements in that. And Jordan Peterson falls into that. But before I want to dive into this particular bit, I want to sort of give you a structure about how I want to set this up, because I've decided I'm going to deep dive. So in the last episode, I talked about Jordan Peterson, the person, and what I can understand from some of the little brief snippets that we had about his background. And I suggested that, as a psychologist, my view of him stems in trying to get to understand who he is. Gabor Mate, like myself, has also talked about Jordan Peterson as being a very angry man, a man who hasn't resolved some of those issues. And the question is, where does his anger stem from? So as a person, I talked about, what's his narcissistic wound and how does that influence his worldview? Because his worldview fundamentally is exceptionally conservative. It's black and white, and he uses the language of politics, right and left, to demonstrate and illustrate that. And I think that we can get lost in the politics of it and trying to understand him, because again, he's not straightforward with it. He's been known to sort of go, well, it's not that I dislike the left, I dislike the radical left. Yeah, okay, when that in itself could be unpacked over days of debate. I'm sure Sam Harris would have quite a lot to say about that. But, the key thing is then understanding Jordan Peterson as an academic and this is also an area where it gets really complex, and there's a whole range of facets around him. Here is a clinical psychologist who's steeped in Jungian psychotherapy, but my understanding is he's never been in psychoanalysis, in Jungian psychoanalysis. He uses it as an intellectual construct from which he derives an understanding of, the world at large, and then, intellectualizes that, politicizes that, and uses it as a foundation in science. His idea of the double helix, which he draws a link to ancient Chinese and Eastern sort of artworks, I've got to say, it's tenuous. How do we? There's no possible way that the ancient Chinese knew that having an intertwined snake represents the DNA double helix. It's just not possible. Okay, it just happens to be a nice coincidence that we can sort of maybe look at and go, okay, at best it's metaphorical. It's not literal. So these things are really incredibly important. So we build up from the fundamentals of science like evolution, biology, and then we move into, what it is that we know of human beings. And this is where I come through when I look at Jordan Peterson as the academic. I go, okay, a large amount of his academic work has been dated. It's, we have neuroscience that actually very clearly argues some of the things that he talks about. Okay, so the next bit is the psychological aspects. What is it that connects neuroscience into the current state of psychology, and how do we understand how people work? That also includes some historical issues, some sociological issues. Okay, so let me then go to the point of Jordan Peterson's writings. Okay, and I'm going to stick to two particular books. He wrote 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote for Chaos. And the second book that he wrote was Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. Now, I was a little bit facetious when I said, how many more rules can we get? Because in my view, one of the things that would, that actually contributes to people's well-being overall is to keep rules down to as small a number as possible, but lead their life according to some core values. And the other issue that comes up for me as I've read through Jordan Peterson's work is that he attributes order as a masculine characteristics or construct, and femaleness as chaos. Now, I immediately had a deep-seated reaction to that because, what's he saying is that women are chaotic and they need men to order them, or that, and he actually explicitly says this, is that society is, works because it's ordered. In other words, if I follow his logic, society works on a masculine construct of order, and that creates a space for women to operate in who are fundamentally chaotic. To me, that doesn't make any sense at all, and I know the fanboys and possibly even Jordan Peterson would come back at me and go, no, that's not what I meant. Well, it sort of sounds it, and I'd love to have a clearer, extrapolation of this whole thing, because, I could argue that the whole of the universe is chaos, and it's in fact, the reproductive process that women find themselves in after sex with men is actually far more about order. I mean, anyone who's had children will know that the way that child rearing works is by imposing, or putting together a structure wherein you work, even if it's simply as, when the baby's awake, I feed it, change it, bath it, feed it again and put it to sleep. Now, that's a structure, right? Now, men don't have to comply to that structure because they're not feeding the kid, all right? So the other aspect of it is the structure of society around maintaining the safety and security of the baby, and by definition, the mother. Right, so to me, this whole concept is back to front. He says that order is where people around you act according to well-understood social norms and remain predictable and cooperative. Yet at the same time, he argues that one of the things that keeps men in line with each other in a relationship is that there is the sort of issue of violence that keeps us in check. Well, that doesn't, if that's masculine, if both of those are masculine, that doesn't make any sense really either. All right? So he talks about chaos, by contrast, is where or when something unexpected happens. Well, that certainly doesn't work where women are concerned, because they're not unexpected. The menstrual cycle is a very, predictable process. The birth process, or the pregnancy to birth process, is very predictable. So I don't know. I'm not sure where he gets this from, and I understand that Jung talks in terms of polarities often, like the yin and yang, but to attribute masculinity to order, or order to masculinity, or chaos to women, in my book is very pejorative. Again, when it comes to chaos, he says it's all those things in a situation where we neither know nor understand. Yeah, well, why the hell is that feminine? I mean, I would go, that's genderless. All of us are in the same boat when it comes to that. And so, he then leads into this place where he ties together evolution, biology, and the social structure. And this is where, again, everything has a hierarchy. Well, it may do to some degree. So let me tackle the thing with lobsters. So lobsters have a dominance hierarchy, and the one lobster that's on top has more serotonin. All of this, by the way, is biologically false. If you talk to some good biologists about this, like for example, like P.Z. Myers and a number of other people, this doesn't hold true. It's cherry picking. The research was cherry picked by Jordan Peterson, and the interpretations are cherry picked. The one thing that I find particularly vexing with Jordan Peterson's sort of connections with evolution and science, and then the psychology of us, is that he's a reductionist. He's a biological reductionist, yet works in the psychological sphere. And, just because we've got a common ancestor with the lobster doesn't mean I'm akin to the lobster. I mean, one of the things that lobsters don't have is a creative intellect. An intellect that has a self-consciousness that is, internally motivated and reflective. I can think my way through situations. Hence, when someone attacks me, I don't need to physically attack them back. Certainly, if I get Peterson's background right, and if he would have been bullied, he wouldn't have been using physical strength and violence to deal with the bully. I suspect he was verbally, absolutely to the point and cutting, possibly using sarcasm and, a bit of sort of linguistic, semantic jiu-jitsu. He certainly wasn't going to be physical. He doesn't have the physiology, by the look at it, as an adult male. So, the first real criticism for me that I want to, I've sort of extrapolated on is this issue of his worldview. It's, reductionist. It's extremely two-dimensional. I mean, to me, social hierarchies in human society are ones that are constructed. And if they're loose enough, we can deconstruct it and reconstruct it according to need. Right? But what we've allowed ourselves to do, and this is what I talk about in Good Men great, is that we got hijacked by this neat little story that said that men are superior, and that the values that we operate within, with what's called patriarchy, is being territorial, lobster-like, I guess, hierarchical, again, a bit like a lobster, acquisitional. Well, lobsters are looking for a safe territory, and then we combative. We really we go for conflict, right? Why? Well, because it's competition, and this is where a lot of the sort of conservatives and the neoliberals go back to this idea of, the survival of the fittest. It's kill at all cost, in order to maintain, right, what it is that you have. Now, again, if we examine human history very, very closely, that is just blatant utter nonsense. And unfortunately, in his first book, 12 Rules for Life, he brings up the issue of how to bring up kids, right? Now, that one's particularly cute because he actually fundamentally promotes smacking, physical punishment. And I have a serious problem with that. A lot of the titles are very cute in that book and, have very good surface validity. I'll give you a classic one, is take care of yourself as you would take care of a loved one. Yeah, no problem. Surface validity is cool. When I got to the chapter on it's a parent's duty to raise a responsible and kind child, I went, yeah, okay, no problem with that one either. Right? But what he's actually advocating is that we need to make children compliant through punishment. And that punishment from time to time is fear. Now, he moderates that and says, appropriate, right? So the issue is that it's based on the notion that children are inherently aggressive, right? It's their natural aggressive nature that needs to be socialized, and if we have to use force, we will do so. While modern developmental psychology tells us that that's actually not true. I've had a lot to do with babies, little children. I'm a parent, a grandparent. I've worked with kids, nowadays specifically with teenagers. And my experience is that aggressive children arise in an environment where they don't feel safe and secure. They don't pop out of the womb wielding, a Thor's hammer and looking for the first person to bite because, the Thor's hammer is metaphorical, whereas, the jaw's there. So, I just cannot come at that, okay? Yet Peterson puts it in the context that, well, nowadays we have a clear understanding of the fact that people are indeed born with aggressive instincts and must learn how to become kinder, gentler, and more civilized adults. Well, let me flip that on its head. My argument is that we have the evidence that children are born and learn to be aggressive in the right/wrong environment, but we can lead them back to becoming kinder, gentler, and more civilized adults. Now, I'm not sure how he defines civilized, because part of this suggests to me that, again, don't buck the rules. One of the things that, again comes out of my readings and paying attention to Jordan Peterson on this level is that he doesn't want us to be progressive to challenge those things that are wrong in our lives to date. I mean, to the point where one of the issues is about, don't advise others, and I'm paraphrasing, until you've got your own house in order. Well, that's a deep-seated irony because, in essence, and I have compassion for Peterson about what he's gone through in terms of, his addiction to benzos and and the challenges, the stressfulness of having a wife that's been diagnosed with cancer. But as a clinical psychologist, I would have expected him to understand that those drugs that he's taking are highly addictive and that you've got to put a lid on that. You can't just go using him, and then expect to not have, a level of tolerance and go into withdrawal if you don't have them. So his house is not in order. And if I go back to the idea that I perceive, Jordan Peterson to be quite an angry man, it again reinforces my sense that his house is not in order. Now, I am not saying that we have to be perfect in order to give advice or guidance. That's not the case. We are not perfect. We are flawed human beings, all of us. But we have a responsibility towards being clear and authentic and take ownership for that and do the best that we can. And within that, create relationships that are healthy and not toxic. So on that note, I'm going to leave it. In the next episode, I'm going to deep dive a little bit further. So I hope you guys are finding this useful. Again, take this as critical thinking, an approach to understanding the complexities of others in the world that we live in. I'm not demonizing him. I am not, throwing him out, like the proverbial baby with the bathwater. I'm saying we need to be very careful about what we take on board, especially with someone who's essentially slipped into the role of a guru and appeals to what I see as progressively more and more of a dangerous population, and that is the conservative and ultra-conservative religious right. And under the current status in the United States especially, that is something which is definitely to be thought about. Until next time, this is me signing off.
Thank you for listening to Inspired Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual and group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.